Hello, welcome to today's devotional. Uh, Once again, we're just working our way through Proverbs one verse at a time. So it's time for us today just to look at the next verse. We're in Proverbs chapter 5, verse 16. And just before I read it, I want to just highlight the verses, the verse in front of it is in particular, and then just remind you of the context, just in case you happen to stumble on this video and not haven't been along for the ride. Chapter 5 of Proverbs in the Bible is talking about faithfulness in marriage, and it's written to a young man saying, "Be faithful to your wife. Don't have an affair. Don't go commit adultery. Stay faithful to your wife." And that's what it's about. But there's other lessons to be learned in the chapter. Lessons about having regret, or lessons about having good motivations in our life and why we're doing things. So there's a number of transferable ideas here. But that's what we're talking about. And when we get down to these verses where we're at right now, it's specifically speaking about having a sexual life in your marriage and how God approves of that, and that's the place for it. And that's the point in the chapter is don't go outside your marriage looking for sexual satisfaction. That God actually made the marriage for that. So you have a wife, stay with her. And of course, it's written to the young man, but this would apply either way. But in verse 14, which is not today's verse, but it was yesterday's, but in verse 14, it says, or not 14, 15, sorry. It says, drink water from your own cistern and fresh water from your own well. So we dealt with that yesterday, and I'm not going to go over it in depth today, but just to draw that image, drink water from your own cistern and fresh water from your own well. And the idea in this is using a poetic imagery to try and talk about a sensitive subject, right? And what it's referring to the well or the cistern, a container for water, and it's referring to that as if that's marriage, right? Marriage is the container for the water. The water is the sexual activity, the sexual satisfaction, and that particular need being met. Like we have a need for water to quench thirst. Well, we have that sexual avenue, that place for it, which is in the well or the cistern, which is marriage. So that's the idea. So we take that idea and we get the counterpoint in verse 16, and that's our verse for today. So here's what it says: "Should your springs be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets." So in contrast to the idea of the well or the cistern that holds the water, it's just everywhere, right? The stream just flows out into the streets, or it's just, the idea of being dispersed abroad is just like out in the field. It just goes wherever. And so the idea there of that sexual activity just being unrestrained and in the streets. Now, the poetic image is very much given to give this sense of what a waste, right? Like water in a cistern or in a well is very useful. You can draw that water and use it properly, and it's there. You go for it. You go to the well to get it, and that's there, and you can count on that. And there's a consistency to it, and so on. The idea of it being dispersed abroad is if you let just let the water go wherever it goes, well then it seeps into the ground and is lost. Or if it flows down the streets, then the idea there, it's like a mud puddle. Like who wants to drink from mud puddles? And so this is what the point is that it's a waste to allow your sexual needs to be met outside of marriage, whereas it's very refreshing and proper if it's met within marriage. So the two verses together are making this point, one for the positive and one in the negative sense. And so to really make this point. And so just to draw on today's verse, particularly the idea here of profanity. What's profanity? Profanity is in the older sense of the word, was a way of referring to when things become common or unspecial or unsacred. And so the opposite of profanity is holiness, right? So like something that is sacred or special or pure. And the idea of profanity always was this idea of you took away its specialness, then you made it profane, which is why we actually in the modern era use the word to refer to a lot of people who speak about sex in a crude way. Well, then they're being profane, right? That's profanity, and that's kind of where that idea came from, because in the biblical sense, that sex was special. It's in a sense, it's holy in a sense, right? It's when it's in the marriage, it's sanctified. It's where it should be, and that's the proper place. And so it's not common, but rather in a sense holy. Not holy like God in that sense, but it's holy, or that it's special or sacred. But if we take marriage out of, or take sex out of the marriage situation, then it becomes profane, it becomes common and unspecial. And so that's the idea there. And of course, we're talking here, of course, about biblical wisdom, and it's not the way the world thinks. And I know that there are many people who could stumble on this video, and you could be, you can be like, well, that doesn't make sense for what I know in the world. And well, fine, that's fine. But we're talking about what God has said through the Bible. So what God is saying through the Bible is that this is the way He designed it: was that sex was supposed to be in the marriage contract, in the marriage covenant, and if it's not, then it's like water that isn't contained. It's just lost, and so it's a shame. Why should that happen? So the question, of course, that might come up is, why is it why is that not a good thing? Like, why is it not good to have common or casual sex? And there's a number of reasons we could give. We could say, well, sex is a very highly personal thing. It creates a definite psychological vulnerability in a person when they engage in sex. There's obvious pleasures in sex, but there's also vulnerabilities in sex, and so to do that in an unsafe environment can actually have a lot of effects on a person. There's a reason that rape is such a horrible crime. It's not just physical; it's also psychologically a horrible crime because of the damage that's done. So you can see there's a vulnerability there. That's another reason why in our culture we think that children should not be sexualized, because they're not ready to deal with the vulnerabilities. And so we recognize that. And that's part of the reason I think that God said, I created a safe place for this. And that's in the marriage covenant. Then in that marriage covenant, because of the commitment of the two to one another, then it becomes a safe place to make yourself vulnerable in this particular way. And if the marriage covenant is not merely a covenant, but also a covenant of love, then the vulnerability is reduced even more, that we really love one another. And so it's a good and safe and proper place for it. Another reason why it's not good to have just a kind of a common or profane or casual view of sex is because the act of sex creates people. It makes people, right? You get babies, and that's a big deal. And we want babies to also be in a safe place. And as babies come into the world, we want them to have a place, a cistern, a well that's been a place of safety that's been built, so that they can grow. Because of course, babies are the most vulnerable humans in the world, and so we want an environment of safety already built before they ever come into the world. And so that's part of the reason God, I think, says this. And then another one is because it just bonds people together. Sexual activity does create bonds between people, and a bond that is not within a covenantal bond then is an insecure bond. And a person that grows and lives in insecure bonds with other people, it has its own effect on psychology and on sociology. And so there's all those reasons, and those are all reasons we can argue whether you believe in God or not. We can argue about those and debate them and say, look, there's a real truth to all these things. But even beyond all of that is the fact that God Himself actually just simply made it that way and said it this way. It's like, this is what I did. And so He blessed marriage, making it sacred. He blessed the idea of marriage right from the beginning of creation. If you read the book of Genesis, right, like it's right there when He brought the first two humans together. He blessed this union, and there's a place of sacredness to it. And so marriage itself is a sacred act. It's a way of unprofaning things and making them holy. And so, there's the world's way, and if you want to pursue that, then pursue it. But if you want to pursue God's ways, and Proverbs talks a lot about those two paths and which ones you should take, and well, if you want to pursue the way of God, then this is the place for it. And God is saying through His proverb, why should it be common? Why shouldn't it be special? Why shouldn't sex be reserved to that special place of marriage? And it really should be. I would really argue God's way is best, and so that's what I would say. Um, so as Christians, if you're not a Christian, you got to sort that out yourself, and I get that. But if you're a Christian, our motive in marriage and sex should be to keep it holy rather than profane. We should desire to, as it says in the New Testament of the Bible, to hold marriage in high honor and to leave the marriage bed undefiled. That's what the New Testament says. It's this idea of don't make it profane. honor marriage highly and see it as God's plan for how to have a really great sex life, a good one, and how to have a good interaction in these areas of our life as human beings in this experience, this human experience, but how to have it in a way that He designed it because it's the best way. And so that's the encouragement there today. Just maybe a little thought about, and if you're married, maybe you never thought about the sacredness of your marriage. Like it really is. It is. It's a sacred thing. It's something that God endorsed, one of the first things He made in humanity, and blessed it specially. So that's something to think about anyway. At any rate, there's our thing for today. I do pray God help us with our marriages just to make them special places and help our world to see that. Anyways, God willing, we'll be back on Tuesday for verse 17. And in the meantime, have a great weekend. If you are able to get to a church somewheres, I would recommend you do that. And if you can't, you can check us out. We'll have our sermon online for you to view on Sunday. Anyways, God bless. Have a great weekend.